I want to update what's going on with the group that some call ISIS. We hear ISIL, Islamic State, but whoever this group, however you name them, however you call them, who are they?
Well, that's a question I get a lot as I came back home. Where did they come from? How did this come about? We've been focused on ISIS for over the last year. They have festered, have become a growing threat not only to the stability of the region in Iraq and Syria, but also to the United States and the homeland. But what's the genesis of ISIS, I think, is a question.
Because they were part of al-Qaeda, but no longer, right?
So there was al-Qaeda in Iraq during our presence in Iraq during the Iraq War. Zarqawi, you may have heard about him. And he started this al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, very extreme tactics, which we saw core al-Qaeda and Zawahiri denounce, which they have done today as well. I mean, imagine that an al-Qaeda affiliate that's so extreme, you have Zawahiri and core al-Qaeda denouncing them. But that was really the genesis of ISIS today. We were able to defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq through the Awakening program that we had to reach out to Sunni tribal leaders to disassociate themselves from al-Qaeda. But since that time, what has happened, in my judgment, was a failure to negotiate a status of forces agreement to leave a residual force on the ground in Iraq to provide that stability. And at the same time, Prime Minister Maliki's inability to provide political reconciliation with the Sunni tribes. So the Sunni tribes now have sided with ISIS over Maliki because it's the only way they can defeat Maliki. We need to reverse that course, and I think what happened in the Awakening is I think, illustrative in terms of how we can tackle this thing head on in terms of political reconciliation. They do have a new prime minister now in Iraq, but I do think these airstrikes are very important to not only stabilize Iraq and Syria, but also to take on what I perceive to be the greatest threat to the homeland since 9/11.
Let's talk about the strikes, and then we'll talk about what that threat might be. It sounds like the president is considering additional strikes into Syria. Where does Syria fit into this, and where does Congress fit into these potential strikes?
No, that's a good question. Syria is really where the command and control of ISIS exists. I think Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was right in saying you can't really defeat ISIS unless you go into Syria. Now that causes more controversy. I'm not in favor of boots on the ground. We have Kurdish forces, Iraqi military that can provide that boots on the ground. What we need are the advisors to guide the airstrikes. And I believe that this is an opportunity now to not only contain ISIS in Iraq, but to defeat them in Iraq and Syria. We're not going to be able to fully defeat them unless we do expand the airstrikes into Syria. We have the Free Syrian Army in Syria, which we need to support to counter these groups like al-Nusra, al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS. I would far greater prefer to take them out there than over here in the United States. It's a matter of time before these jihadists could come into the United States. In fact, we have one documented case of a man from Florida who returned to Florida, then went back and was a suicide bomber. That's the kind of profile that intelligence officials and Homeland Security officials are most concerned with, because unlike Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have a safe haven now, larger than Afghanistan and Pakistan, larger than what bin Laden had, where they have Western passports. They have free reign to Western Europe and travel back to the United States. They're one plane ride away from hitting us here. And I think that is the great concern we have and what we're trying to stop in terms of ease of travel, identifying these individuals and stop them before they can come into the United States and attack the homeland.
Do you think if, obviously those strikes into Syria are on the table for the president, does that need to go through Congress?
I do. I think, the authorization of use of military force was in 2001. It's outdated. I think we need to update that. I think it would be good for Congress. The administration has been in consultation with the Congress under the War Powers Act. When that expires, I believe the administration, it would be important for them to go back for additional authorities and update what's called the AUMF to give that authority to the president. Congress has the power to declare war under the Constitution, and I think it's time for the Congress to exercise that authority.
Meantime, another story that people follow course, border security, and I'll kind of segue from this conversation into that. We're hearing a lot of Republicans, including here in our state, including Governor Perry, saying that we have a porous border and that extremists can utilize that coming through Mexico into the U.S. Is that legitimate? I mean, do we have evidence that that is occurring, or how big of an issue that might be?
I mean, it is a concern, and this is why it's a concern to me. We do pick up what they call special interest aliens from countries that have terrorist ties at the border. That concerns me. I met with General Kelly, who's the head of Southern Command, which is basically our U.S. military for basically Mexico, the Mexican border all the way through Latin America. And his point of view was if 60,000 children can freely cross the Rio Grande Valley sector, then who else is going to be crossing to get into the United States? There are threats out there, and I think ISIS, after the beheading of the journalist, really opened the eyes to the American people as to what the threat is that we're facing. Now imagine they have legal travel documents, but the ease of travel across the Mexican border obviously presents a concern to Homeland Security officials.
So even though, for example, the plane trips that were taken by, like this example from Florida, that's one potential area, but you think that another potential, at least in theory, would be crossing the border from Mexico?
It's another entry route into the United States. In the bin Laden compound, we did find documents where he was interested in obtaining access to the United States through our southwest border. So I take that very seriously. My job is to look forward as to what the threats could be and how to stop them from getting inside the United States.
Almost out of time, but I do want to get your thoughts about when you return to Washington after the recess. The House did approve a border security plan regarding what's going on in South Texas. Does it look like that has a chance anywhere beyond the House?
It's unfortunate that we passed a bill responsibly to deal with the crisis, and we led, and then the Senate, the very day before we passed it, left town to go on vacation. I think that's irresponsible. I do think we're going to have to address this issue when we get back into town in September. In the meantime, we have to reprogram, how they call it, monies within the Department of Homeland Security to make sure that Customs and Border Patrol and ICE and other defenses along the border are fully funded. That's the number one priority for me. And we're going to make sure they have that money, but we need to pass some legislation. We need to, we did in our bills, we funded the National Guard presence on the border, which the governor's already deployed.
Right.
And we don't think it's appropriate for the state of Texas to have to bear that burden when, after all, Paul, it's a federal responsibility.